Okay,
Okay,
so
Andy, when you're ready.
thank you. So yeah, as I said before, I work for the Environment Agency. I work in the Fisheries, Biodiversity and Geomorphology team, and along with a guy called Will Kitt, who works in our flood defence team, we kind of manage the invasive programme in Yorkshire. And Yorkshire, next slide please. Yorkshire is the biggest Environment Agency area, so it's a big catchment. You can see that we've got an isolated catchment over to the east around Hull, but then after that pretty much everything's connected, and invasives are all through this system in varying amounts that we'll have a look at in a second. Next slide please. So we've put together our Yorkshire invasive species strategy for FCRM works. Now FCRM is effectively our flooding teams. So we've convinced our flood teams that they should be spending money on treating certain invasive species. Next slide, please. So currently, this is what we're doing. We've got a strategic and headwaters down approach on all our main rivers. We've got one dedicated contractor who treats all of these, and that's really quite important because the piecemeal approach of previous years hasn't really worked. And coming on the back of that, we're hoping to develop landowner engagement models and partnership working on non-main rivers. So the main rivers are, keep it really simple, the main rivers are the main rivers, the big rivers throughout Yorkshire, and the non-main rivers are the smaller tributary rivers that feed into those. We don't have jurisdiction over those. We only have jurisdiction of the main rivers, but obviously invasive species don't recognize those boundaries, so we need to be dealing with invasives wherever they are. So we are trying to work on non-main rivers or help to work with people on non-main rivers where possible. Next slide, please. A river stewardship company based in Sheffield have got pretty much our entire contracts for invasives control, and they are experts in treating these certain key species that I'm going to mention in a second. Next slide, please. Japanese knotweed being the most obvious one. You'll all know Japanese knotweed. It's been here for a long time. Came in as a screening plant in Victorian times and has grown happily along our riverbanks ever since. And this is one of our target species because its root system it's a bit like an iceberg. What you see on the top is only a tenth of what's below the ground, and that root system is extremely strong and capable of damaging lots of our flood defence assets. Next slide, please. The next one is giant hogweed, not one that particularly damages our assets, but more a health and safety risk because of it's got this phytotoxic sap, which obviously is very damaging if you come into contact with it. And you know, we don't want our operatives coming into contact with this plant, so we've taken the approach that it joins our list of naughty species to treat. Next slide, please. And the third one is floating pennywort, which is a very, very damaging invasive species because it grows on the river itself rather than on the bank. The other two are bankside species. And down south, they've got horrendous problems with this plant. But up here, we've managed to get on top of it quite early. It does keep reappearing, and we do have to control it. But it's a bit of a success story in Yorkshire compared to other areas. Next slide, please. For example, on the River Thames, they spend a fortune dealing with this plant, and we don't want to get into that position. We want to get in early, treat it early, and avoid these kind of costs. And finally, next slide, please. Avoid having to use this kind of machinery to deal with this plant, which grows at a phenomenal rate and also grows pretty much all year round. So it'll happily grow in the winter if temperatures are anything above freezing. So it's a species that we are targeting very heavily. Next slide, please. So the timeline before 2017 in Yorkshire area, we had ad hoc management of these three species and others occasionally on land that we owned or on assets that were being threatened by these species. But then in 2017 we produced the strategy that was in my second slide, and in 2018 we surveyed all the rivers, all the main rivers of South and West Yorkshire, and we also kick-started the floating pennywort treatment. We then took the strategy to what's called our asset management group, and they basically say yay or nay to anything to do with spend, flood defence spend. And they approved the strategy, and in 2019 we got going with treatment of Japanese knotweed and giant hogweed and floating pennywort, of course, on all the main rivers of South and West Yorkshire, which is no mean feat, given that no other area in England does this. We are the first area to treat third-party land. And then the north and east main rivers were surveyed in 2019. I think there's one more line there, Alex, that you just need to, and yeah, and then from 2020, the rivers of the north and east Yorkshire also came under treatment. Again, no mean feat, because these are very extensive rivers, and even the survey alone took a long time. But now every main river in Yorkshire is under treatment, so it's early days, but it's a pretty impressive spend we have going on these three species. Next slide, please. And just to show you headline what we came up with in terms of the survey. RSC surveyed on foot at every meterage of main river, so these surveys are totally accurate. And you can see on the River Aire, giant hogweed and Japanese knotweed both a problem. On the River Calder, it's mainly Japanese knotweed, and on the Don catchment, which encompasses a lot of rivers, it's mainly Japanese knotweed, with the exception of the River Dearne and the River Rother, which have quite a lot of giant hogweed. These slides don't show floating pennywort, and just to inform you on that front, floating pennywort particularly affects the lowland rivers of the Calder and the Don. Next slide, please. In the north and east, the situation is quite different. This slide is slightly, it gives a slight not accurate reflection of what it's like out there, because these instances of these species are much more sporadic. It's not as continuous as it looks on that slide. But giant hogweed, as opposed to the south and west, giant hogweed is the main enemy here. I think that's mainly because these are rural rivers, and they've not had the history of contamination, landfill, all sorts of things that has encouraged Japanese knotweed in south and west. Next slide, please. So partnership working has to be important. Obviously, we've thrust ahead and done all this work. We're spending a lot of money on treating these rivers, but we can't do that forever. So we are looking for partners, and we're looking to try and eventually get buy-in from more people to help us out. The Environment Agency sit on the board of the Yorkshire Invasive Species Forum, along with the people that are on this call and others besides, and that's, YISF that we call ourselves. It's a very good way of coordinating our approach and letting other people know what we're up to, and also knowing what they're up to. Yorkshire Water very kindly contribute to our programme, 10% of costs on average, and the Canal and Rivers Trust, they also do their own invasive treatment. It's a bit clunky, because what we would like is one contractor to do everything, but at least they're doing their bit. And then after that, it's landowner engagement, and the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust have got their own engagement model, where they're working with us on the River Derwent and also on some catchments of the Calder. Oops, excuse me. And also on the non-main rivers of the Suno, that's the Swale, the Ure, the Nid, the Ouse and the Wharfe. We're supporting our partners in trying to do something similar there. Next slide, please. Long-term outcomes, therefore, reducing the cost of maintaining our assets by treating all of these invasives. Hopefully, eventually they'll come down, by using a strategic headwaters down approach, working in partnership with key stakeholders, landowner engagement to gradually replace our treatment on third-party land. We will always continue to treat our land and assets, but it's the third-party land that's contentious, which will mitigate the risk of prosecution for us and for our other landowners. Improving natural resilience to erosion by getting rid of these invasive species. Next slide, please. There we go. Sorry, just missed that little bit off there. Go back, sorry, Alex, if you don't mind. Amenity, biodiversity and water framework directive benefits are also apparent if we start managing to get rid of these invasive species. And obviously fisheries interest as well. Next slide, please. And I was asked to mention American signal crayfish because of course they're invasive species, and of course they're a big issue. They're a big problem for anglers. Our policy varies between the north and south of England. Yorkshire still has populations of native white-clawed crayfish, although they're in serious decline. As a result of us still having them, we do not allow trapping for commercial or personal consumption. It's different in southern England, where there are no white-clawed crayfish across large areas, so trapping is allowed there. But in the north, we're not alone. The northwest are the same as us. Trapping is not allowed. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah, no change likely there. And this slide is a really good one. American signal crayfish. Some people think American signal crayfish and white-clawed crayfish is quite similar. They're not. American signal crayfish are obviously much more aggressive. They're much more predatory. They live in much higher numbers. And this was a catch from a drawdown on a short section of river. And I think the key here is that people think that trapping works in reducing the population of American signal crayfish. Well, it doesn't really. If you wanted to trap American signal crayfish to a point where the population was actually going to disappear, the amount of traps and the trapping intensity you would require would be huge. And so also it only selectively tends to trap the bigger animals because of the mesh size. The smaller ones escape, and then they don't have any natural predators because these things are carnivorous and they eat each other. So you remove the big predators and the smaller ones have got more chance of survival. It's a disaster, there's no doubt about it. American signal crayfish are a nightmare for all of us, but unfortunately, unless you're in an enclosed fishery, trapping is simply not going to work, certainly not on rivers. And I think that is me. No, there's no slides lurking after this, are there, Alec?
No, I think that's a lot. So that's brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Andy. So if anybody's got any questions for Andy, if you just pop those in the chat now. I see we've already got quite a few and we'll pick those up following the next two talks. So what I will do is now I will load up your presentation, Steph, and we will take it from there.
All good, and you can hear me?
Yeah, whenever you're ready.
Sounds great. Okay, brilliant. So obviously thanks for having us. Look forward to hearing what people want to discuss about invasives and biosecurity. So we're here today, me and my colleague Rachel. I'll be giving the presentation, but there's two for the price of one. So focusing on biosecurity and invasive species across Yorkshire. So next slide, please. Brilliant. So why is it important for a water company? So just to kind of get the lay of the land. So invasive species are very important for a range of people, but for water companies like Yorkshire Water, we have a big operational commitment that we need to deliver that can be affected by invasives. Aspects of our management for our they cause management issues on our assets, which often come with financial issues. And also we work very, very hard to try and enhance water quality and sometimes spend a lot of money upgrading treatment works, for example. But unfortunately, invasives can undo some of that progress that we're trying to work with other sections of the business. So we really need to address invasive species. Here, I've just highlighted some priority invasive species for a water company, for Yorkshire Water. So here we've got zebra mussels, which you may or may not have come across before. killer shrimp, which luckily we do not have in Yorkshire and we want to keep it that way, and obviously floating pennywort, which has already been mentioned just now. Next slide, please. So how do we manage invasives? So the focus here today is biosecurity. So obviously that is one of the ways that we manage invasives, and it's our first form of defence. We effectively do not want to have invasives in the first place, and then we don't need to deal with them. But obviously that's only one string to our bow. So biosecurity, just so we are all clear, is practical steps to stop the spread of invasive species. So we need to consider as a water company, firstly, how do species arrive, aka how are they introduced into in the first place to the region, somewhat like Yorkshire, and then also how can they spread within Yorkshire, and obviously that includes onto our assets. And I've just got some photos here of examples of invasive species that you may see on your equipment, but also like on that end of my colleague's finger there, that's a zebra mussel, which is absolutely tiny. So we do need to kind of consider both the visual invasives that we can see, but also the really small stages or even obviously diseases, which is very relevant for angling. Next slide, please. So there's obviously lots of different pathways and associated vectors, we call them, that we need to consider as a water company. So these can include kind of vehicles and large pieces of plant that we're bringing onto our sites, also small bits of equipment like boots or clothing, and also recreational equipment. So I just wanted to kind of highlight here that whilst obviously we're very much talking about angling this evening, that's not the only pathway that we need to consider. And as a water company, we're addressing all of these pathways to hopefully enhance biosecurity and upskill a lot of different users. So we also need to kind of identify these high-risk pathways to prioritise our management. And so we've done that in line with the GB non-native species secretariat pathway analysis that's available on their website. So we've considered looking at all these different pathways, and again, therefore looking at how we manage the way that invasives could spread in the region and what can we do about it. Next slide, please. So firstly, in terms of our own operations, so like I've been saying, we need to consider all our pathways within our operations that could accidentally move invasive species and ensure biosecurity is in place to reduce that risk. So first and foremost, we have staff, they go places. We need to ensure that we have obviously biosecurity in place there. Similarly, we work with a range of contractors, and so that obviously is still very applicable. We do have tenants, including angling tenants, boating tenants, farming tenants. And so again, whilst we have our general visitors to our own assets, we also have our kind of tenanted visitors. And also we do have volunteers that visit our sites. So again, these are all avenues that we need to have biosecurity in place to ensure that working collectively, we can reduce that risk of spread of invasive species, both on our assets, but also more widely in Yorkshire. So just to highlight on that point, as we know and appreciate, invasives do not understand boundaries. So whilst obviously as a water company, we do need to consider our own assets, we don't kind of stop at the end of our assets. We want to work at that kind of catchment level to ensure that we can ensure that we've got biosecurity in place to protect Yorkshire as a whole, as well as our own assets where we may have higher things to do. Next slide, please. So what does biosecurity look like in practice? So effectively that is following the principles of check, clean, dry. So that is the National Biosecurity Campaign, which outlines simple steps to take to reduce the biosecurity risk associated when things are moved between sites. Hopefully you'll likely have seen this information before through many comms channels, even potentially with your rod licenses. And again, this is in line with the high priority pathways. There's also check, clean, dry guidance that's specific to certain pathways like angling as well. Next slide, please. So what does biosecurity look like across operations? So we ensure that we have training and equipment for our staff and our operators to conduct that best practice. We are also incorporating biosecurity in our policies. We already have biosecurity policies, but there's always further ways that we can incorporate that to ensure that we have biosecurity across the way that we operate. For example, that could be the planning of works. So that would just be identifying if we have any invasives on site prior to the start of works, and then looking at the appropriate biosecurity to both ensure that no invasives arrive onto that site, but also no invasives leave that site due to the fact that Yorkshire Water are operating there. And we are also, whilst we're providing the tools to do biosecurity, we also want to ensure that it's being done on the ground. So we are conducting biosecurity audits of our staff and of our contractors to ensure that those, the training and the equipment and the policies that are all in place are being enacted on the ground. And so we're really drilling it home with biosecurity. We want to be conducting this best practice day in, day out, just as a normal working day. It's not an additional extra, it's just part of your day. And then also you've got their permanent facilities. So we are also going to be looking at assessing sites and seeing where we could potentially have permanent facilities that are needed there, but also considering the feasibility of installing facilities there. And so that's something just to highlight, and that will be coming up in the future. And it will be something potentially for some of our high risk sites, and we obviously need to identify where those are and then see what biosecurity is possible there and would be appropriate there. Next slide, please. Yorkshire Water also then contribute to national and regional projects. So this includes putting funding towards working groups and projects in relation to invasive species and biosecurity. So these include the Aquatic Biosecurity Partnership. So that's a national group of water companies, the Secretariat, the Angling Trust and other project delivery partners to develop biosecurity at that kind of national level. Here in Yorkshire, we fund Alex, who you're going to be hearing from shortly, so I'll let him speak for himself. We also do have a crayfish officer working on a native and invasive crayfish project, which also includes aspects of biosecurity and invasive species and raising awareness. And finally, we also have the Yorkshire Invasive Species Forum that's already been mentioned as well. So we very much want to engage at that catchment level and work with a range of stakeholders, because that's the best way that we're going to then be able to deliver the best biosecurity implementation that we can. Next slide, please. We also do a lot of raising awareness, and so firstly we engage during Invasive Species Week, so that's every May annually. You may have seen our emoji game and our video posted last year during that week, and so again, just to highlight, watch this space, there'll be some more, probably some emoji games, but something interactive coming this May as well, just to highlight the importance of invasive species biosecurity and obviously what people can do about this issue. Next slide, please. Alongside the Invasive Species Week, like I've been saying, we work with a range of catchment partnerships to also enable others to raise awareness and engage with a range of stakeholders. And we also engage at events, so things like the Great Yorkshire Show. We like very much, where we can, would want to engage with more stakeholders on the ground, and potentially even at regional events, such as potentially angling events coming up soon. And that would be something that would be really interesting to hear about as well in the discussion. Next slide, please. And so whilst I've been talking predominantly about our operations, obviously today we're talking about angling, and I've put a slide in about angling, but I have highlighted again that it is one of the many pathways that we need to consider for invasive species, and Yorkshire Water definitely want to ensure that we look at all those pathways. But in terms of angling, as I mentioned, we'll be working with our tenants, including our angling tenants, to further incorporate biosecurity and also potentially identify where certain assets need permanent biosecurity facilities, seeing if that's an option and seeing what that looks like in the future. We also have a lot of visitors to our site. So we do have our specific tenants, but we also do have visiting anglers. So for example, our two fisheries at Swinsty and Fewston, and also Danflask. And so again, biosecurity is going to be a high priority there. And within our wider catchment work, we also want to contribute to enhancing biosecurity at that catchment level. So including working with the angling groups, working with the Angling Trust, like we are right now, to try and ensure that we also have that kind of tailored biosecurity message and kind of tailored advice for the different user groups. It's great to have the generic check, clean, dry, but being able to help people understand how that's relevant for their specific activity is going to be really important, and we'd very much like to engage with that. And I believe that's me. So with that, thank you for listening to this short presentation and look forward to hearing your questions.
Oh, that's
There
brilliant.
is a final
Thank you,
slide,
Steph.
but it's just an end.
There we go. Brilliant. Thank you, Steph. Right,
Thank
what
you.
I'll do is now I'll load up your presentation, Alex, and then we can go into the Q&A. So I see we've already had plenty of questions in already, with more coming. I see Andy and Rachel have been hard at work answering some of those in written format, but I'm sure we can maybe discuss them in a little bit more detail across the panel later on. But any questions for Steph, please do pop them in. And of course, any for Alex. So I'm just going to get your presentation up now, Alex.
Thank you.
And yeah, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me today. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I am the Inns and Biosecurity Officer at Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, and here to talk to you today about biosecurity for water users, and in particular a project that we're running at the moment, which is looking to raise awareness of biosecurity in South and West Yorkshire. Now, I'll just add a bit of a caveat that the scope of the project is looking in South and West Yorkshire, but we do have, or there is possibility for us to work outside of this region. So just because you're not in South and West Yorkshire, please don't feel like you're excluded from this. Please still get in touch, and please still feel like this applies to you as well. But yeah, we'll carry on and proceed with that. Next slide, please. Yeah, so biosecurity, what is it? You can press again, Alex. So biosecurity, well, when we're talking about biosecurity, you may have heard this in relation to COVID and the pandemic as well, and a little bit around healthcare. But when we're referring to biosecurity, we're thinking about invasive species, and we're thinking about a series of measures or procedures taken to prevent the spread of invasive plants, animals, or diseases. And these procedures really can range from simple checks of equipment or checking materials entering or leaving a site, right up to disinfecting whole areas and thorough procedural checks that we might see at borders and customs and stuff like that. Okay, next slide, please. So why is biosecurity important? So really, when we want to look at this graph at the moment, so biosecurity is important for a number of reasons. But if we look at this graph, when we think about biosecurity, biosecurity is relatively cheap to implement. So if we look at the very bottom left and we look at prevention, there's a prevention bar, and that is reflecting the cost of biosecurity and what it would cost to implement that without anything else. Then we look afterwards, there's a species introduction, and what we can see is that because there's a species, we then have to control that, and the costs then rise and grow as a species is introduced and spreads further afield. And then, as we can see, that exponentially grows over time until we get to long-term management, at which point it can be quite hard to deal with and control invasive species. Not impossible, but it becomes a lot more difficult and a lot more expensive than if we'd had this early prevention, early biosecurity steps in place. Alex, you can just press again. Yeah, so inns have a major impact on biodiversity, which is why biosecurity is so important. So inns are the second biggest threat behind habitat destruction to biodiversity loss globally. Next one, Alex. And they can, because of this, they can often establish quickly and able to outcompete native wildlife. And again, if there should be a picture, Alex, if you just press again. So this is an example of a site in South Yorkshire in Barnsley. And this is actually right next to a fishing lake in Barnsley. And fortunately, it was actually came onto this pond rather than the fishing pond. I guess fortunate for the fishing pond. But it's just an example of how quickly and how easily an invasive plant or invasive species could take over. So this is actually water fern, which hasn't been mentioned yet, but another species which can quite easily take over and completely smother a watercourse. And I would imagine if there was no other action taken, it would be spreading onto that fishing pond, which is next door, neighbouring to this other lake that's adjacent. And the next point, please, Alex. So yeah, and because of this, inns are very difficult and costly to eradicate. And then next point, Alex. As opposed to biosecurity, which is very cheap and easy to implement. And next slide, please. So our project, so we're working in partnership with Yorkshire Water until March of 2025. And again, we're looking to work in South and West Yorkshire, but again, we're not solely focused on there. We can work outside of that area. So please don't feel like you're excluded if you're outside of that area. Next point, Alex. And what we want to do is want to work with water users. So we've sort of specified this down to anglers, paddlers and boaters, but not exclusively. So hence why I'm talking to you guys here tonight, but we are looking to work with and talk to paddlers and boaters as well as wild swimmers and sort of anybody that really is coming in contact with the water environment. that we think might benefit from learning about biosecurity and learning about the spread of invasive species. Next point. So yeah, the big emphasis of tonight is that we can, as part of this project, we can deliver free training and advice. So you don't have to pay for anything. We'll come out, we can deliver training for you. We can help you develop a risk assessment if needed for your site in order to help with that implementation of biosecurity. So essentially we're willing to do the work, or I'm willing to do the work to make your lives easier, preventing invasive species coming onto your site or maybe spreading further afield if you might already be unfortunate to have someone on your site or at your club. The next point. Another thing is that we have money to be able to fund equipment. So we can not only deliver the training for free and give advice and be here to support you throughout. We have a fund to be able to provide the equipment that you will need to be able to implement biosecurity and incorporate that into your activities, be it at your club, at your site, at your fishery, wherever it is. We have money to be able to help and facilitate with that. Next point, please, Alex. Another thing which you can see some pictures of on the right hand side is we can run biosecurity events. So credit here to North Wales Wildlife Trust. This is actually a biosecurity event that they ran in Nottingham. Unfortunately, we haven't had the opportunity to get out to events as the project started in 2020 during the midst of a pandemic. And obviously that's restricted people getting together. So unfortunately, I haven't been able to get out to events yet, but I imagine as we're coming out of this pandemic, we'll be able to get out and people will be getting more active and more events will be more likely to take place. So yeah, what we can do is run biosecurity at these events for you. We can facilitate that and deliver training to help you, your members, whoever it is, to be able to deliver that training, or we can deliver that for you or in partnership. We're also looking as well to get out to other events. Steph mentioned earlier the Great Yorkshire Show, but any sort of like event generally that clubs might be running where we can come and talk to your members, we can talk to about biosecurity, we can raise awareness, that sort of thing. We're happy to come all along and attend those events as well. Next point, please, Alex. Oh yeah, that's what I was just saying. Yeah, so we want to raise awareness, yeah, biosecurity, yeah, by attending those events. Thank you. Next point. So what can you do? If you can press Alex. So we can think about biosecurity at your club or your site. So this might be, think about what you might already have in place, if you already have something in place. An example here that I have is of a biosecurity kit that our staff use across the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. And we have these amongst our teams and at various different sites. So this is something that we might want to be able to think, about, and potentially something that we might be able to fund, but we might want to cater that a bit more to the angling community and what might be more useful for you guys to be able to clean and follow the check, clean, dry procedure to be able to prevent the spread of ins on your equipment. So yeah, the other thing we can be following check, clean, dry, so stuff that we can kind of do without this. We can be checking over our equipment before leaving sites, cleaning, and then again, drying is a really important part of that aspect and preventing the spread of invasive plants and animals on wet, damp equipment. Ins can actually survive for quite a few weeks on wet, damp equipment in damp conditions. Another thing as well, just to be aware of, is to utilise some of the angling trust materials that they've already produced. So there is guidance. I think Emily features in a very useful video showing you how to be able to clean and check your equipment and hopefully prevent the spread of invasive species on their website. There are other guides as well and useful resources there that are already out there to be able to help you. And again, I can link you to those, or going through the angling trust there, I'm sure they'll be able to point in the right direction to use stuff like that. And as well, please get in touch with us, get in touch with myself. We've set up this project, those projects there to be able to help and support clubs all across Yorkshire to implement biosecurity, and we're here to essentially do a lot of the work for you and make it easy as possible for yourselves to be able to implement biosecurity as part of your activities. So yeah, get in touch and we can hopefully try and help you do that. And again, if you may be struggling, if you're maybe an individual member and you don't have some of the those higher powers to be able to get your club doing something on a larger scale, you could look into doing something individually yourself. And if you just press the next point, Alex. And there's a picture here of a boot, but maybe not the most useful for cleaning down your equipment, but a very simple thing that you can use to clean your footwear and hopefully reduce that risk of spreading some sort of invasive species. And I should say I don't get royalties for these, but they are quite a useful little tools to have around, and they're very small, about the size of a 500 milliliter water bottle. So very useful things to have. And next slide, please. And then this is another thing. So we can just have signs. Again, this is something that that's available and that we can help install or help install on sites to help try and raise awareness around biosecurity with people attending those sites, members, whoever it may be. but something that can guide you through the process of check, clean, dry. And again, we can get these in poster format, or in a sign that we can install on the site. And again, we can facilitate in helping install that as part of this project. So I think next slide, please. I think that might be it though. So thank you very much for listening. Please do get in touch. We have money, we can deliver free training. We're there to support you guys do this. So please, I hope you do want to feel part and want to get involved in this project. Thank you.